Well, it's time now for Media Watch. Emma James is with us in the studio looking at one of the stories I mentioned there. Emma, good to see you. We're talking about what's been going on in London today. It's 10 years since the 7/7 bombings and commemorations and memorial services going on across the capital.
Yes, absolutely. 2005, it saw the biggest terror attack ever to hit mainland Britain, and it was the first time that suicide attackers had ever struck in the country as well. Many publications and websites featuring eyewitness accounts of what happened that day, looking perhaps for a slightly different perspective 10 years on, and obviously in the light of what's happened in the decades since that, since those attacks. The Guardian has spoken to a Muslim survivor, Mustafa Katuldu, and he reveals that he's had to justify his faith ever since those bombings, basically. He said, in the immediate aftermath, journalists wanted to know my opinions on terrorism, as if being a Muslim suddenly made me an expert. Sadly, I was treated more like a suspect than a victim, he says. He also expresses anger over recent remarks by the British Prime Minister David Cameron, saying that some Muslims are quietly condoning extremism. Now, this man says he's tired of having to explain that he's not guilty by association. He does suffer from guilt, but not because he's a Muslim, because he survived that attack and so many others didn't. If we take a look at the UK edition of the Huffington Post, they're featuring very heavily these bombings in London. They've done a series of articles entitled Beyond the Bombings. This one in particular is written by a writer, David Macaulay, who met the man who actually masterminded, orchestrated these coordinated attacks in London. There were, of course, 3 blasts on the Underground, 1 on a bus. And Mohammed Sadiq Khan, back in 2002, was actually a teaching assistant in Leeds. And that was when this writer met him. He was working for a Times educational supplement. And he describes this man as having a broad smile, being animated and affable, and clearly seen as a role model within the school, which is part of what was so terrifying about those attacks, the fact that these were people who were
integrated
British.
in the community, right?
Integrated, working
Northern
in a school,
accents.
yes, working at a primary school, working with young children, and the idea that somebody could then turn and do this in the heart of the United Kingdom was really very shocking. Now, this writer says that you may remember the video of Mohammed Sadiq Khan, which emerged following the attacks, where he explained his reasoning for what he did. And what this man says is Khan is unrecognisable in that video. Curiously, he is still holding a pen, but it seems he'd long ago given it up in favour of the sword, says this writer. Another curious article, which is strangely moving, on a blog site that normally deals with dating and table manners and all kinds of strange things. But this is a gentleman who actually was very close to the attacks. He didn't actually survive them. But what happened to him is that he was basically trying to get on the tube, kept being redirected, ended up being redirected almost into the path of the bus bomb, which went off at Tavistock Square, because, of course, that was an hour later than the ones on the tube. And he describes it's almost the mundanity of his experience that makes it all the more shocking.
He was probably pretty furious at the time, wasn't he?
Exactly. And he explains that, saying that, you know, whenever we get delayed, we always get very angry about it. But he says that he describes how on TV explosions are huge, impressive fireballs, booming, crashing, spectacular. Witnesses who usually know the blast is coming thanks to pages and pages of script foreshadowing it look on in shock and awe. Real life, he says, is not TV.
Yeah, well, an awful lot of people were using the tube and the buses that day, and an awful lot of people had near-miss stories, I'm sure. But it's not just witnesses, people who were almost witnesses, telling their stories. We've been hearing from journalists and politicians around the country as well, haven't we?
Yes, and one of the things that a lot of people are talking about is the speech that was made by Ken Livingstone. He was the London mayor at the time of these bombings back in 2005. Hugo Rifkin tweets that Ken Livingstone on 7/7, exactly right, the one political speech of my lifetime that has made me cry. Now, interestingly, Ken Livingstone himself was on LBC Radio earlier today, a local London radio station in the capital, very popular, has a great deal of listeners, and they actually played back his speech that he gave on that day. Let's take a listen to what he had to say and see his reaction.
They choose to come to London, as so many have come before, because they come to be free, they come to live the life they choose, they come to be able to be themselves. They flee you because you tell them how they should live. They don't want that. And nothing you do, however many of us you kill, will stop that flight to our cities. where freedom is strong and where people can live in harmony with one another. Whatever you do, however many you kill, you will fail.
A very strong speech there from Ken
Yes,
Livingstone.
and clearly quite choked by listening to it again. We didn't see it in those images, but he was then seen rubbing his eyes, clearly wiping away a few tears. And it was a very emotional time. If you cast your mind back, these attacks happened the day after London had been awarded the 2012 Olympics, which is why Ken Livingstone was in Singapore. He'd been there sealing the deal on that. And of course, all those celebrations, and then this happened the next day. And I think partly that's why that speech resonated so much with people, because it came on the back of what had been absolute
joyous occasion, right?
Exactly.
I mean, everybody was pretty surprised London got the Olympics, and then right after an attack really on the heart of the city. And
yes,
I think people travelling on the tube was never the same again for a lot of people. So.
No, absolutely not. And it's not just politicians being remembering the events, journalists too, looking back at how they found out about this story. Alex Thompson, who's a reporter for Channel 4 News, one of the national broadcasters in the United Kingdom, he talks about how he learned of what was unfolding. And there was initially a lot of confusion about, was it a power outage? What had really happened? The image there is of that bus in Tavistock Square, which was the final blast to go off. But one of the things that's most interesting about his piece on this is the images that he gives us that were actually taken inside the underground system as people were being shown out from the trains. If you can imagine the fear those people would have experienced.
People were brought out of trains and had to walk along the side of the tracks.
Along the tracks. They walked past, some of them had to actually walk past the trains that had been blown up, and they saw bodies and parts of bodies. And you just see this terrible image, the gloomy image of them seeking safety. Really shocking times.
Really shocking. All right, Emma, thank you very much indeed. Emma James.